everybody. Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. We got another true crime episode today.
Wait a
That
minute.
means, oof, buddy, we love coming back to these Aris Pina CompuBox operator, and also, we love this boxing history kind of thing. He's with me here today. Talk about some true crime. Hector Lopez, dude, how are you?
Doing good, man. This like you just mentioned, we're back to doing a true crime episode for the first time in a minute, but it's on a subject of a very popular and fun fighter from the 90s that we're gonna feature today. Like you mentioned, Hector Lopez. So think about it, the junior welterweight division of the 90s, right? Like we're talking about well, first the junior welterweight division that gives some history to the context here. Was one of the junior divisions, so it took a little bit of time for it to gain like traction in the boxing world before people really take it seriously. I mean, I think the first world champion won it in a ballot box, didn't he? There was even one actually in the ring. I think it was Pinky Mitchell that won
Well,
it.
and even then he was like even then almost all of those first kind of iterations of the junior champions in the 1920s and 30s and probably into the 40s were like often teased by
Yeah.
newspapers and stuff like that.
So, but the what I'm trying to get at is that from a division that came from a bunch of scrutiny, or whatever, it's gained a lot of history, and it's looked upon now as historically as a great division, and look at all the history and the great fighters and all-time great fighters and great fight stats come through it. So Hector Lopez in the 90s, when he really came of age and when he was really on television and such, and like the fights that we're going to mention and which you probably seen, what you remember from him, um that was the type of era where it was right after where first he had the early of the the early 80s, the Aaron Pryor just rampaging through, and then once he fizzled off, um, from there was a little bit of a scrum, but then Buddy McGirt emerged after he lost to Meldrick Taylor, and then Julio Cesar Chavez came of age. Julio Cesar Chavez basically was, looked upon as the undisputed champion. He was still settling at junior welterweight when Hector Lopez was doing a little work over there, but was slowing down. But Lopez wasn't really involved in that. You know what I mean? He was more involved in the era where you had guys like Charles Murray, Jake Rodriguez, my old friend Ray Oliveira, Carlos Bolio Gonzalez, Samuel Fuentes. These were all WBA, Carlos Costa Zoo, guys like that. These are all WBA, IBF, WBO champions. This is kind of where it resided, but this was a very, very strong era in the mid 90s. All these guys produced a lot of fun fights. All these guys basically fought each other at some point or another. Some didn't, but for the majority, they all kind of got around with it. And all of them made for a lot of fun fights. Hector Lopez was right in the middle of this. And the issue with what brings us to him to us talking about him today is that basically there was a whole other side to Lopez aside from boxing. He was a very skillful guy. We're going to talk about the beginning of his career, where he came from. He was an Olympian, all this other stuff, but there was a whole other side to him too, where it was deep down in the streets of South LA, and everything like that. And it's pretty murky and it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, man. He obviously we're here talking about it as a true crime episode because some dirty stuff went down. There are some parts that like there I wish there were more gaps that there I wish there was more that we could fill the gaps, but we'll talk about what we do know and what we do know about as far as his career and the history and stuff like that. But it really is a fairly not only a historic time, but it's just close enough in terms of being recent. And, there are a lot of people that could listen to this episode that could actually remember having watched him fight because it wasn't
Totally.
that long ago. I mean, it, I'm not going to lie. I don't remember having seen him at the time or anything like that. I'd tell you if I did, but I don't
He was a
remember it.
little bit before my time too. I mean,
Yeah,
I
just a
was.
little.
Oh, he was still active while we were fans. I mean, I did watch the Randall Bailey fight, which we'll discuss later on. But like you said, when he was active and he was being featured around, this was a little bit before us. And at that point, I was mostly watching HBO and like Showtime. I was still, finding my way as a fan. So,
I might have seen the Randall Bailey fight, but I mean, honestly, I might not have. I don't know.
It's a long time ago.
Yeah, yeah, it's been a while. But in any case, it is just recent enough that a lot of people might actually remember this stuff. And I mean, it's just kind of it is ultimately an unfortunate case. And this is, I guess, part of that, true crime and also history show where I go into the kind of history of this kind of thing, I guess. It's just that to me, I do see a lot of the unfortunate pieces and I guess, sadness, I guess, in this story, because you have a guy in Hector Lopez who's from Mexico City. He's born in Mexico City, and according to him, is brought when he's a toddler, when he's 3 or 4 years old, to live in Glendale in Southern California, or I'm sorry, it might have been Palmdale. Well, one of the Dales in any case, it was that's in Southern California, and so he's brought there, and according to him, grew up proverbially on the streets and in that area, and so excuse me, his mom never got him citizenship and he never got citizenship, but he found his way into a boxing gym when he was fairly young and got pretty good enough that he was participating in a number of notable amateur tournaments. So just to kind of rattle off a few real quick so you understand that, it's fairly serious. Something that caught my eye was in 1983, he defeated Kennedy McKinney in the Golden Gloves Tournament of Champions. So, I mean, Kennedy McKinney, apart from being a future world champion, was also a very good amateur. He also had his own
gold medalist.
Yep. Well, and he also had his own demons, of course, that wound up derailing him significantly. But yeah, he went on to become an Olympic medalist himself, and he was actually eventually defeated by a guy named Jose Rosario in that tournament, the Golden Gloves Tournament of Champions. He fought in the California State Amateur Boxing Tournament in 1983. He was ranked top 10 nationally in 1983. He fought in the Western USA Open 83, fought in the National PAL Tournament in New Mexico 83. He was enough to have a handful of write-ups in newspapers as an amateur, and especially as an amateur who's clocking in at like 110 pounds or less. That's significant because I mean that kind of discrimination against lower weight fighters even extends into the amateurs. But he had a few write-ups. He was described as elusive. One former opponent, a guy named Conrad Sanchez, that he defeated a number of times in the amateurs, said to local newspapers complaining that Lopez simply, quote unquote, looked pretty and didn't do any damage after getting beat by him. So he was bitter. And he found his way. He boxed his way to the 1984 Olympics in LA.
And as we know before then, like the 84 Olympics, most famous for the birth of so many all-time greats out of that team, as well as, I think, what was it, 9 gold medals? Not 8, or 9 medals, 8 gold medals, whatever it is, like off the top of my head. But yeah, that was the class that he was in right there too.
It's that ongoing debate about which team is greater, like the 76 or the 84. You know what I mean? There's
an asterisk to the 84 team, right?
Like, it's a pretty significant asterisk.
It really is, because the Russian team and the Cuban teams were not there for that.
That's a very significant.
And I was actually going to ask you that really quick too, because like, let's think of the gold medalists off of that team really quick. Like, Whitaker still probably would have won a gold medal, because there is footage out there of him beating, his Cuban contemporaries of that time, and he was deemed the man during that era. Like, he had a few losses as well, but Whitaker, more or less, you can kind of bank that he probably would have won a gold medal. Evander Holyfield could have been a little bit more difficult. Sure, he got screwed the way he did against Kevin Barry, but at the same time, it would have been very difficult. Had other opponents and like from countries much more demanding than which was at the Olympics, could have been there. Tyrell Biggs, who won a gold medal, chances are he definitely would have got spanked again by Teofilo Stevenson. They had fought previously, and Stevenson had already proven to be his master. So Meldrick Taylor, same thing. Taylor was very young at that point. He was, 17, 18 years old. second youngest Olympian from the U.S. team ever, besides Jackie Fields. So same thing. If you want to look at that, Taylor had already proven himself to be up there, but would have been much more tougher. Steve McCroy, the list goes on and on. So I don't know. What was your thoughts on all that? Because
Well,
like the 76 team, that's at that point, I don't mean to cut you really quick, but like the 76 team altogether, that was the competition was at its apex.
yeah, I think that team defeated tougher competition to get their medals, and I mean, arguably wound up well. Nah, there's quite an argument actually about which team was greater as far as pros. That's tough. That
Totally.
well, that's far more of a debate.
Yeah.
but
I would go ahead.
but yeah, I think that it's a pretty big asterisk that for a number of those fighters, and a number of those guys looked kind of shaky as amateurs too, or shaky in their wins. And yeah, dude, I think that well, actually what I was going to say, and I'll want to say it before I forget, what Hector Lopez was actually 17 when
That's when I knew he was a teenager.
so he was pretty young himself. And I guess it's not really that unusual for fighters of that size to be a little bit younger, I guess, but he competed fairly young. And yeah, so that team had a far clearer path to medals. And I think that kind of we saw that bear out with all the medals that they wound up walking away with. But still, regardless, they all wound up being, either very good or great on one level or another. And so, funnily enough, one of the complaints, and you probably wouldn't see this nearly as much now about the Olympics, at least I hope, U.S. writers in the LA Times were complaining about how a number of fighters and a number of the other Olympians that were foreign didn't speak English. What? And they were complaining about translators and shit like that. But apparently Hector Lopez spoke just enough Spanish to be able to do interviews both in English and in Spanish. So he charmed his way into the press corps for the Olympics, in the 1984 Olympics. And I found that kind of funny actually. But ultimately he wound up with a silver medal at the 84 Olympics and for Mexico. And the whole story behind that was that since Hector Lopez was not a citizen, he was brought over and was not a citizen. He could not fight for the U.S. in the Olympics and wound up fighting for the Mexican team, which he said the Mexican team later resented him quite a bit and wound up ultimately respecting him. They probably respected him because he was a good fighter, but didn't respect him because he was not truly Mexican to them.
Totally understandable, because that's happened in many times in the sport. And if you're not from if you're not like a national from there, a lot of people on the team, because you'll get attention sometimes, it's more jealousy as well because you're better than a lot of them, and Lopez probably was better than a lot of people on the team. It kind of boils down to a lot of that type of stuff. And so you have to really prove your worth, because they don't feel you didn't grow up around them, you didn't grow up in the team with them or anything like that. You kind of just got transplanted because for whatever reason you couldn't make the US team, and so you're not actually one of them.
According to him, he wound up having to defeat the Mexican national champion in his division, and then after defeating him, they said, according to him, he said they made him fight him again in order to get a spot on the team. In fighting him and beating him the first time should have been enough, but that they pulled the dirty one on him and made him fight him again, but that he beat him again and fought his way onto the team again and got onto the team. But I mean, I think that's also kind of part of what I was saying, the sadness of this story earlier, because you have this guy who probably never felt as though, he maybe felt more at home on the streets than anywhere. And I'm not trying to say some weird poetic or philosophical shit, but for real, because he represents Mexico in the Olympics. Excuse me, man. He represents Mexico in the Olympics. and the Mexican team doesn't really accept him. You know, he's not accepted onto the American team, the US team, because he's not a citizen. He probably faces some form of discrimination, you know, just in everyday life, in on the streets in Southern California, especially during this time in the 1980s and 1990s. Bro, we were talking about movies about this the other day, and I mean, I know that they're exaggerated, I know it's Hollywood and shit, but there's some element of truth to a lot of this, and we already know now, like, knowing what we know now about the power dynamic between police and people of color and all that type of shit, you know,
Totally.
that's another element of this. And so, and then once again, you know, just kind of the, not to beat a dead horse, but again, the discrimination of being undocumented, of being someone who is not a citizen, and the things that you can and can't do or have to worry about doing, or having to worry about getting in trouble because then you can be deported, or it's, you know, et cetera, your family could be deported. You know, these are the actual everyday kinds of worries that immigrants have in not just the US but other places too. So in any case, again, not to beat the dead horse about this thing, but I do see a lot of sadness in this story for Hector Lopez, and it's not, you know, a fun story. And just like a whole lot of other people that we've seen and a lot of other fighters, boxing wound up like that was his ticket, one way or another. You know, it was his ticket to, even if it was just stability. And unfortunately, like so many of these true crime stories that we focus on, that was not to be.
Yeah, man. You know, a lot of these fighters, like you just kind of alluded to, you're looking for a home. You know, like you said, he wasn't accepted on the U.S. team. He had to fight his way onto the Mexican team, but he wasn't really accepted over there too. And you're looking for an outlet. You're looking for something. Like, you know, at this point in time for Lopez, like you said, now the only, you know, the streets are calling for him because that's one place that's kind of more accepting. They accept everybody. You know, there's no discrimination against on the streets. If you can be useful, you know, you can just be taken in for something. And so the streets were beckoning with him, but at the same time, he's still a very talented fighter, and he doesn't want to give that up yet. And so he's kind of like at a balance between like what's gonna, you know, go on with himself. And this is gonna be a pattern that continues on with that throughout his career and throughout his life. That he continues on as a fighter because one, that's his profession, that's what he's good at, and he's never really done anything else, and he's talented at it. So keep that on. That's how you're gonna make money. But at the same time, you've been in the streets for so long, it's kind of hard to say goodbye to that and try to pull yourself away. So it's kind of like a balancing act, trying to pull both ways. And for Lopez, that's what he ended up doing in his career. But considering those circumstances, he still had a very successful career.
A surprisingly successful career, really. um I mean, even surprising, it's not like I look at so many fighters records that it's I don't even know what I'm looking at half of the time. But it's possible I've scoured through his record before. I don't remember it though. And then looking at it far more intently for this show and just going over it, I was just kind of like, damn, he fought him. Oh, he fought him too. Oh shit, you know, just a whole bunch of fighters I didn't realize he fought, or fighters that were far more in the mix than I realized. So in 1985, after winning the silver medal in the Olympics, right, he turns pro in 1985. Like, you know, any Olympian would, you would imagine, like they're going to turn pro fairly
Mhm.
shortly after that. Um, but he turns professional and rattles off about 10 wins, right? And he gets into, first of all, I should say, in his first handful of fights, he fights not only at the Olympic Auditorium, but also at the Forum, too. And I mean, those are two extremely historic fight venues for the 1980s and 90s in particular. I mean, the Olympic Auditorium going way back even, but regardless, very historic and important fight venues in Southern California. So if you're fighting
Yeah.
at those places, like you're, you know, the few and the proud, bro, like you're in there like swimwear. So that shit is definitely a massive opportunity
And
for
they come
Hector
out in the
Lopez.
masses for one of their own, bro. That's for one thing, man. It's always had an amazing atmosphere anytime I've seen it on television. I've never actually been able to attend a fight live out there, but just watching, you know, from television, the old fights, current fights, whatever it may be. Like you said, man, it's definitely intense.
Yeah, dude, the Olympic Auditorium has a lot of fun boxing and wrestling history that, is always like, if you're into that kind of stuff, if you're into history, it's really cool.
Hmm.
And the Forum too. The Forum, like you said, always has a really cool atmosphere. So to be able to fight in those kinds of places in your first like dozen fights, that's pretty big. And not only that, but he finds his way onto national TV a handful of times too, and ultimately onto ESPN in 1986 for they're having a tournament for the ESPN featherweight title. Like, you mentioned that earlier, like back when it actually meant something, which is, it
They
sounds
did to a
funny,
degree.
but
Yeah.
but it's true. And it's almost like a couple of years ago when they did maybe more than a couple of
The
years ago
box,
now,
the Boxicino.
Boxino.
Yeah, Boxino tournament.
Yeah, and people were making fun of it, and they're like, "Oh, what is this?" And it's like, bro, they've been doing this the whole time. Like, it's the same thing as having the California featherweight title or the New York. It's it's not an actual champion. It's just, I mean,
But they
but
got, but I mean, it's a lot of guys that had careers that were a little bit going nowhere. Once they joined that tournament, they got some sustenance to it. I'll give
that's,
you a
yeah,
perfect example: Frank the Animal Fletcher. Frank Fletcher, early in his career, was a middleweight, kind of going nowhere with a very spotty track record himself outside the ring. And once he joined the tournament, I think as a substitute, I might be wrong on that, but he came in and dominated the whole thing and ended up winning the tournament. All very, very exciting fights. And from there, he became a household name on television because he was featured from ESPN, which is his early stages. And then he was featured on network television and became huge on network television because not only was his fights exciting because of his wild style, his crazy ass mom would be right outside
yeah,
ringside
his mom.
screaming and going batshit crazy. And it was just a whole spectacle. But that's just to give you an example right there. Like the ESPN title, ESPN was still in its infancy. Well, at this point, it gained a little bit of traction by 1986, but like the early stage of the ESPN, we're talking 1981, 82. That's when they were having that title had been around for a minute, and anyone who won that belt, at least they were going to get some television time and have that for a springboard to at least a bigger fight.
Exactly, yeah. And it definitely was not going to be any sort of guarantee that winning that title was going
Yeah.
to make anybody a celebrity or a star or anything like that, but it could potentially be putting them in a situation they could be ranked top 10 or top whatever, and then from there get a title shot.
Well,
So yeah, it wasn't any sort of guarantee. But one of the funny things all right, just to kind of move the timeline along, in 1986, Hector Lopez defeats Francesco Segura in, I guess, the opening leg of the Western Regional Featherweight title for ESPN tournament. But then a couple months later, he faces Georgie Navarro, which might be a familiar name for a number of people, for the ESPN featherweight title. And so basically, both fighters cut from headbutts. Both fighters landed multiple low blows. But according to the reports, Lopez had difficulty catching up to Navarro, and he was soundly outboxed over 12 rounds. And then for winning, Navarro received not only the ESPN featherweight title, but a $1,000 bonus and some unspecified new car. So,
that sounds about right because remember when another tournament they used to go down. Remember the Great Western Forum used to do tournaments?
yep, that was actually, so they rematched. And when they rematched,
Oh, well, there you go. I'm looking at it right now. The Forum featherweight title. Yeah.
their rematch was for the Forum featherweight title, which, according to Lopez, going through that tournament, I don't think it was just that one fight, but the tournament itself, like, he netted $100,000 from going through that tournament, which is, I was like, holy shit, especially for that time, that's very significant. But he went on a really, really good run, actually, against Refugio Rojas, a contender around that time, Bernard Taylor, who we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier, a very close fight with
That
Eusebio
was a big
Pedrosa.
win. Big win because at that point Taylor was probably his biggest win at that point. Taylor was a part of the 1980 squad that didn't make that didn't make the Olympics. And he was a tremendous, tremendous boxer who, like you just said, he fought a draw with Eusebio Pedrosa for the title. In a
Very,
fight,
very close fight. Yeah.
very
And
close fight, very
Pedrosa was a
boring
dude
fight,
who
but a
was,
very, very close fight.
and Pedrosa was a guy who was for a while considered like not unbeatable, but was just like a bear. You know, he was
Yeah,
tough as shit to deal with. And to fight it to a draw with him that's no small potatoes, dude.
not at
He
all.
also defeated a guy named Oscar Bejines, who was a guy who, if you follow the kind of Olympic auditorium history and a number
Him
of
and
those
his
fights,
brother.
was a regular from the Olympic auditorium days, right around that time. So, I mean, he was definitely fighting and defeating very good contenders or guys who were just on the fringe of that, like, contendership. And yeah, that was actually a really, really good run.
I mean, those are solid names right there for you, man. I feel like you mentioned too, especially back in the day, if you're looking to become a contender, if you're looking to crack the top 10, if you win the Forum featherweight title, that's again kind of like the ESPN one. You might not, it's not the same in terms of television exposure, I would say, but still winning that would net you like a lot of exposure and would at least put you in the talks for like a bigger fight, if not a top 10 ranking or so, top
Yeah,
15.
it's career changing.
It is career changing because like yeah, I think for those tournaments you want a car or you definitely want some cash or some sort of prize for another. And like yeah, that's from there, you're the champion, you're gonna get more exposure at the forum now. You're definitely gonna be featured for more fights there, and eventually that's gonna parlay into a minor title fight, into a major title fight. So Lopez was on a roll at that point, and things were looking up. And as he moved along with his career, like you said, man, eventually by the early 90s, um, well, no, that first, he's still going to 1989, but then there was a little bit of a gap. And that's when we can start talking about, his
Yeah.
outside the ring activities that we were alluding to earlier.
So when in 1988, in later 1988, when Lopez was 21, he reportedly went to the family home of his 24-year-old girlfriend, who was named Norma Gomez, and kicked and punched her father and pistol whipped a family friend
Damn.
who happened to be there. And he then took Norma against her will, at gunpoint, and she apparently returned home by taxi 2 days later and had like a knot on her head, and like her arm was all bruised and messed up,
Mhm.
probably from being like grabbed or something, I would imagine. And Lopez was arrested on kidnapping charges shortly thereafter. Um, so after nearly 9 months of court hearings, he actually fought, I think, twice while he was not in custody, but after having been arrested for this. But after about 9 months of court hearings, kind of being in and out of custody, Lopez was sentenced to 4 years for burglary in a plea deal in 1989. It looked like he was credited with some time served, and he was released in October of 1991. The only thing that I had really seen about his time in prison was that he had said that a lot of people tried to fuck with him because he was a fighter,
Yep.
and that apparently according to him, there was a guy that was quote unquote a heavyweight who walked up and sucker punched him, and that the only thing that happened was that Lopez smiled at him for a second and then dropped him.
Sounds about right.
Which, I
There's,
mean, it
there's a lot of
sounds,
articles about Lopez talking about his experiences in jail when he would have like gaps in his career when, he'd get incarcerated for something. And he would come out and be like, oh, he always got tested out there. And so this would get a lot worse from that too. It wasn't just getting sucker punched. Sooner than later, he got stabbed. He would get stabbed up. Other people would try to kill him, attack him. Like it's crazy, absolutely crazy.
I mean, yeah, I guess it's prison. You know, you ain't gonna be
Yeah,
having,
man.
you ain't got babysitters there and shit. But it's pretty wild shit, and it doesn't sound ludicrous. I mean, it sounds crazy, but then when you think about it, and it's like a pro fighter. Oh, okay, that
Well,
doesn't
I'll
really
give
sound
you
like
an
it's
example too. You know how a more recent example, right? Rydell Booker, the guy who's kind of like a journeyman today, right? You know how for a number of years he was inactive, and I think that was because of think that was because of well, he went to jail for a number of years for like trafficking,
Yeah, I was gonna say like did like drug trafficking or some
something
shit,
like that.
right?
Yeah. And I remember I didn't ask him this, but someone next to me asked him or whatever. And, during his time in jail, was he ever tested? And he said every single day. He said that, and he had to fight every day, and he had to keep on beating people up every day until they finally people just stopped messing with him, and they just realized, all right, enough is enough.
Yeah, it's just
Especially if you're a fighter, if like
oh, so you
unless
think
you're
you're
like not
tough?
Mike Tyson. Yeah,
Like
exactly. If you're not Mike
all
Tyson or
of
whatever,
them.
there's gonna be some dude who's gonna look at you and be like, I could take that. You know what I mean?
We talk about that shit all the time. The most unassuming looking motherfuckers who will beat your ass. It's like just don't. That's why you don't fuck with people. But
We
yeah,
talked about them, like imagine, it's tough to bring this dude up because he was a clear psychopath, but imagine going into a bar and you see Edwin Valero, the way he would dress outside the ring, right? Wearing his like
wouldn't
overcoat,
even
and
think
his
twice.
lapel
Yeah.
shirts and his like glasses kind of looking like a weird comic book character or something. And you
Next thing
bump
you
into him.
know, it's Joe Pesci from fucking Casino with a jamming a pen in your neck. Like
Yeah,
like
just
what the fuck, bro?
well, you wouldn't realize, but he would thrash you and all of your friends in with the half a blink of an eye, with like the scariest
Seriously.
look ever. Yeah, so
Well, on the other hand, Hector Lopez did not look unassuming. That fool looked like a vato for sure. That
no, he
fool,
did.
he
And this
looks he looked pretty
this was
rough.
during his career. Absolutely, he didn't try to hide it. That's what I'm talking about when he balanced both careers. He was who he was. He was just kind of like, this is who I am. This is what's going on. But I'm here to box. I'm not here to gangbang. And to give him credit to himself too, he never really carried himself like an absolute like obnoxious person or whatever. He was very quiet, kind of, and kind of standoffish, but like just very, quiet, kept his distance from the world, whatever it may be. But like, if you were to talk to him, by all accounts, he wasn't a bad guy. He was very nice. He was very intelligent, and would give you a good interview and talk to you. But just a person that kind of kept his distance as well.
Yeah, he seemed like he was fairly he wasn't super gregarious or fucking talkative. Like he was
Yeah,
not like outgoing like that. He seemed, by most accounts, it sounded like he was a nice guy, like on person to person,
yeah, totally.
generally speaking, a nice dude, easy to talk to. But when it
Just
came
had
to
his demons.
yeah, well, and when it came to fighting and when it came to going to the gym, according to everybody, he just came in and like went about his business. He
Mm-hmm.
wasn't coming in to have fun. He wasn't coming in to fuck around. He was coming in to train. He was coming in to do work. It was his job. And also, I think that it seemed like that was what was keeping him straight. That was what was keeping him kind of on
Completely
any
falling off the deep end.
yeah, any sort of straight path that he ever had. And unfortunately, that it didn't seem to last long. But going into the 90s, like you started kind of talking about earlier with this crop of junior welterweights. So when he gets out of prison in 1991, according to him, he gets out of prison at 160 pounds. So keep in mind, he's fighting at 126 pounds. He's fighting at featherweight before that. And gosh, I'd have to think in my head real quick when they stopped doing same day weigh-ins. I guess it would have been in the early to mid 80s because it was after Spinks, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad 2 fell through. So that would have been 85
Yeah,
ish.
I want to say
Some
Sphinx. Yeah, around 83, 84. Yeah,
something like that. So right around the same.
83.
Well, anyway, the only reason why I say that is just to kind of get an idea in my head. Like, is he
Totally.
cutting shitloads of weight? And no, he probably isn't. So getting from 126 to 160 pounds, like that's a significant amount of weight for a guy that size. But he said, according to him, that it wasn't even that he was not training or anything like that. He said that the prison diet was awful and that he was still training every day. He was doing push-ups and he was doing all sorts of shit, that he was in good shape, but that the prison diet was terrible. And so he was like bloated and gained a bunch of weight, and that he dropped weight super quick when he got out of prison, and that he got right back into this mixture. Like I said, you were talking about the junior welterweight mix coming out of the 80s. When he's getting back in the 80s, he's at featherweight and stuff like that. He's talking about fighting Azuma Nelson. He's talking about fighting Eusebio Pedrosa. He's talking about fighting all
Larry
these other,
McGuigan, guys like
yeah,
that.
and by the time like that first of all, featherweight's in the rearview mirror, and second of all, that crop of fighters, except for Azuma Nelson, was basically in the rearview mirror by this point. And
Totally.
so, in any case, he wound up in 1994 losing a decision to Costa Tszyu, who was 10-0 at the time, which I think probably says something about where their respective careers were at the time. Where if Costa Tszyu, who himself was a highly decorated amateur and was by at this time being guided somewhat carefully, if they felt at 10-0 that they could put him in with Hector Lopez, they probably felt that Hector Lopez was well beyond his best or something they could definitely handle, and he did.
But
But
his credit, man, Costa Tszyu at that point was like a special prodigy talent
that's
because
true.
like he was like a different ilk. I mean, today you see guys like when Loma first came on the scene and a few other guys who get hot shot into a world title kind of quick. It's more commonplace. When Tszyu first came on the scene, that was something much more uncommon. I mean, he wasn't hot shotted to a title
Right.
within his first 3 fights, but right away, Tszyu was fighting guys like Hector Lopez, Juan Laporte, who Lopez actually did beat early on his comeback in the early 90s.
Right. Yeah.
And Juan Laporte is a former featherweight champion, one of the greatest chins in boxing history, fought a who's who of top, you name him, he probably fought him at one point. And so that was a good win. So, and also too, Lopez did fight, ended up getting a world title shot soon after that because he became an NABF champion. And he fought Miguel Angel Gonzalez,
Right. Yeah.
who was the WBC lightweight champion. And for people who listen to the show, I'm sure you obviously know who Gonzalez was, but at that point, Gonzalez, I remember reading about him as a kid. He was an undefeated guy at this time. He was 28-0, but he was he was a respectable, solid champion at lightweight. I mean, everyone kind of considered Oscar De La Hoya to be like a level above him, and if they had ever thought that De La Hoya would defeat him, which inevitably happened. But Gonzalez did have a lot of good wins on his ledger. He was a really tough guy to beat back then. And Lopez put up a competitive fight, but he lost, a clear decision. Regardless, and as the time when he ends up fighting Tszyu, like you said, man, Tszyu was a super amateur, the amateur world champion. He beat Vernon Forrest. I think he beat Shane Mosley. Like he was, a level above everybody. And so at that point, he had, when he fights Lopez, he also fought Sammy Fuentes, who was the WBO a longtime contender who ended up becoming the champion. Livingstone Bramble and Juan Laporte. This was all within his first 10 fights. Like that's, in the 90s, people were just kind of like, huh? If anything like that ever happened, it was usually a guy in Thailand who was a kickboxing champion who after like 4 or 5 pro fights ends up, beating another champion and winning or something like that.
Yeah.
But
And you're only reading about it from Joe Koizumi, and that's it.
Totally. But to see a guy like Tszyu and everyone's just kind of like, wait a minute, is this kid the real deal? Look who he's beating. And then you see him pasting these guys and barely breaking a sweat. And you're like, well, he must be. Laporte's past his prime at this point. Livingstone Bramble is past his prime at this point, but there's still guys who can give you hell. And Tszyu is not losing around against either one of them and beating the living daylights out of them. He's knocking out Sammy Fuentes in 1 round. Sammy Fuentes was as tough as nails guy. So it's like, it was a good, that was a good test I think that would be a good test for Tszyu. And to his credit, if you look at the end of that fight, bro, look at their faces, man. Tszyu looks like he was in a car wreck.
Yeah, he went through a fight.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is that even just watching, there is enough video. There's enough fights of Hector Lopez that you can get a good idea of what he was like as a fighter. And he's a good fighter. He's a very good fighter. He puts punches together really well. He moves really well. And, it's kind of like when you look at the fights from later on in his career, he probably doesn't move as well at 140 as he did at 126 and everything. And like I was saying to you too, when you look at YouTube, you can actually find some footage of him at those lower weights from the Olympics, and you could see that he is a little bit more mobile as a fighter, but he's very skilled, very slick. Just doesn't get hit nearly as clean as he should, type of fighter. And he put it on Tszyu in a handful of those rounds. It's right there on YouTube. But still at 10-0, that's, to me, it's like, that's quite the fighter to put your 10-0 fighter in against.
Oh, that's major. That was a big step up, man. And a lot of people, I'm not sure if a lot of guys would do that today, if they'd be willing to do that, because again, Zoo is considered a super
Yeah.
prospect, and it's kind of
He had like 300 amateur fights
yeah,
or something
and
like
he was a
that.
monster.
And even
And
back then, that was considered like, who the fuck is keeping track of your amateur fights to say you got 300? Like, that's crazy. And now, like you just brought it up, like Vasily Lomachenko, Alexander Usyk, a number of these fighters who were amateurs for a long time have amateur records like that now.
exactly, exactly. And it's interesting. A guy like Zoo, if you watch, like I remember the first time I watched Zoo was on the pay-per-view where he knocked the hell out of Jake Rodriguez, right? And me and my best friend were watching him, and we both like were just digging him because we had no idea what Costa Zoo was. This is like the infancy of my boxing of like my boxing fandom. So I'm seeing him in his rat tail for the first time, and Rodriguez coming in there all smiles and stuff like that, and he who Rodriguez kind of looked like. Um, Remember those infomercials back in the day, Body by Jake or something? Kind of looked the
Yeah.
same, but he kind of looked like the same dude. You know what I mean? He looked older than what he was.
It's like Jake
And so,
Seinfeld or Jake Steinfeld or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. And so, anyways, Costa Zoo just beat him, like absolutely bludgeoned him. And I became an instant fan because of it, because he was a cool guy with a rat tail ponytail and just beat the shit out of dudes. You know what I mean? That's what more couldn't you like? But yeah, for if there's a very telling photo that I saw in either Ring Magazine or KL Magazine after the fight of Costa Zoo Hector Lopez, and it shows Lopez kind of just like disgusted after he hears the decision. He almost looks not like in disbelief, but he's just kind of like he has to suck down like another bad pill because he's been used to this before. And he has his arms on his waist, and he just like has his head just kind of turned in disgust. And then you see Zoo being catered to, and his face is just a mass of like welts and blood, and he just looks like he's just being king. And I think his wife is in the corner screaming.
Yet another case of that not necessarily telling the tale of the fight. Um,
Totally.
but I
But
mean,
also too,
it's
he should say, man, that might not have just been like Lopez's fist doing the damage. By all accounts, he wasn't afraid to use his elbows, headbutts, and anything else. Like he fought to
yeah.
win.
Well, and according to reports and stuff like that, because I'm reading fight reports from earlier on in his career, according to reports, he was able to fight a few different ways. Like he was generally slick and like probably more of a counterpuncher, but that he could fight and be aggressive and get in close and bully, be rough, and that when he did, he liked to be rough. Like I
Mhm.
was saying against early on in his first loss, according to the reports, like it was back and forth, kind of dirty fight, but
Yeah.
against Georgie Navarro. But in yeah, I guess that kind of fits the narrative, fits his personality, a guy who grew up on the streets and had to kind of do a lot of things the hard way and the rough way. Um, I don't know, it's kind of cliched, but also somewhat true. But during this time in the 1990s, dude, he fought a number of actually really good fighters. Ener Julio, who actually went on to be not really a good fighter by any means, but fought just about a who's who. If you go to his record, he fought a who's who of a number of from 135 to 140-pound fighters from around this time and into the 2000s. Israel Cardona, a
That's
number of
Pito
these.
Cardona, right?
What's that?
Is that Pito Cardona? Yeah, it's the same.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, that was his
Yeah, totally. Israel
just
Pito
his
Cardona.
nickname. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's just what he went by more often than
But
not.
that's the now what I mean is that was the guy that like had the run in the late '90s, early 2000s.
And he was undefeated at the time that Hector Lopez beat him. Uh, yeah, dude. And Julio was undefeated by the time he beat him. He faced Alfonso Sanchez, who was
Yep.
undefeated at the time but lost a close decision. I mean, he was on a pretty good run right around the 90s. It was just that there was clearly a level that he was not going to get beyond. The question is, obviously, would he have gotten beyond that level if he could just keep out of trouble, if he could have kept his head on straight? Because and it almost seemed like the answer to that was almost certainly yes, because you look at these little chunks of time where he was able to string together good wins, even between losing to Carlos Gonzalez in 1997 and then losing to Randall Bailey. He strung together 5 pretty decent wins between that.
Yeah.
And
Mark Lewis is an underrated win. Mark Lewis, I mean, the WBO champion, and we've talked about this many times. in the 90s was, didn't really carry a lot of sustenance, but Lewis was a good fighter. He was a WBO champion at that time, and that was a quality win.
Yeah, it actually. I'm not saying he was beating world beaters,
Yeah.
but he was clearly putting himself in. That's must have been so frustrating too, to put himself time and again in the position to be like a solid contender, but then just fall short because there are actually some good fighters out there who were just he couldn't get beyond.
And it was also too if he really dedicated himself fully, because by all accounts, yeah, he was a really tough guy that would work out, but there were, at a lot of times too, he would only just do so much, just enough, just to make himself that he would like get in a certain amount of shape, but still cut corners to a degree because he was able to. Like his natural talent was able for him, to get by. Like a lot of fighters that tend to do that sometimes. And also too with his out of the ring activities, he was never going to devote himself 100% to boxing because he still had a calling on the other side. And so yeah, that's maybe why he still fell short a few times. And at one point, it became like heartbreakingly close. We mentioned Sammy Fuentes earlier when we talked about him fighting Costa Zoo, but Sammy Fuentes was another very, very, very tough contender. Didn't have the best record, but a tough guy from Puerto Rico who gave Julio Cesar Chavez hell and a bunch of other fighters hell for a number of years before he ended up becoming a WBO champion in the mid 90s. So whenever Hector Lopez ends up getting a title shot against them, and they ended up producing in 1995 it was, and they ended up producing, bro, one of the best fights I like, closet classics you want to call it, you'll ever see. It was available on YouTube years ago. I mentioned to you about it, and I think I tried to look it up, and I didn't see much, so I'm not sure if it's still on there. But that fight was awesome. All right, if you want to just talk about from round 1 to round 12, just a phone booth, they beat the hell out of each other, both guys. All right, but it was like in a skillful manner. It wasn't just both of them sitting there and just completely, flailing away like a drunken bar brawl. Like it was really good infighting, and it was just awesome from bell to bell. And Lopez got dropped in the very early in the fight for a flash knockdown, which rarely ever happened for him because he was just a tough guy who had an iron chin. But that ended
That's
up
what everybody always said about him too, was that he
Yeah.
could take like a monster punch.
Totally. And Fuentes had a few points deducted in the fight as well. But I mean, like, for what, it was just a very, very close nip and tuck fight. Both guys took a lot of punishment in it. But at the end of the fight, Fuentes ended up, scraping by on an extremely, extremely close decision. But there's a lot of like funny backstories to that too, like some shenanigans that went on because, as we talked about earlier, I mentioned to you, when I first learned about Lopez as a kid, it was because of articles of Ivan Goldman. Ivan Gold, to longtime listeners, I'm sure you remember Ivan Goldman, who was who had columns in both Ring and KO magazine. In the beginning of the magazine, like next to Jeff Ryan's columns. So Goldman was a friend of Hector Lopez. A lot of people weren't close to him, but Goldman ended up, becoming a part of his circle over time. So every now and again, he would write articles, kind of, those little articles that he had, he would dedicate them to Lopez and whatever was going on with him. So I found one now that, hold up, let me bring it up here really quick because it's pretty interesting. That he talks about the Fuentes fight, and I'm gonna actually quote. I'm gonna read a few parts of it over here because it's actually interesting to give you like some background of what went on with it. So he writes in June 1995, after Hector's first jolt in the can, like the way he put that, he and Sammy Fuentes fought one of the most savage fights I've ever seen for Sammy's WBO title. But it was their bad luck to be viewed by only fans on the scene in Las Vegas and on a local LA channel. Had more fans seen it, it might have been Fight of the Year, and both their careers would have been enhanced. They murdered each other for 12 full rounds with no break in the action, and with tact and skill, punching, countering, and countering the counters at breakneck speed. Hundreds of the 2,000 or 3,000 watching in Caesar's Palace that night were LA gang members who came to see Hector, one of their own. Sammy was an LA guy transplanted from Puerto Rico. His fans were outnumbered, but vocal. When I described the fight to my East Coast editors at Ring, I detected a hint of disbelief, so I shipped them the videotape. After viewing it, of course they were enthralled and asked me to write a feature. I should have demanded an apology too. This is the interesting part. It was Hector's bad luck that Sammy's trainer was savvy Charlie Gurgan, a good friend of mine. If you're from the West Coast, Charlie Crocodile Gurgan should be a name you would recognize. At the weigh-in, Hector stripped down naked, so when he mounted the scale, two members of his entourage shielded him with a towel. Suspicious, Charlie slipped back there and caught one of the two manipulating the scale with his foot. Charlie slapped him away. Hector had to work off about 2.5 extra pounds in a few hours, weakening himself. He'd cut corners in training because that was his way. He got a kick out of breaking rules. Inside the ring, he was dirty as hell and very good at it, employing a repertoire of elbows, low hits, headbutts, and other mayhem. He felt like he had a third eye to watch the ref, who was almost always on the wrong side to see his fouls. I remember another trainer telling me Hector had a very educated head. Sammy was no slouch himself in the nasty department. He'd once broken another fighter's jaw with his shoulder. The referee, Mitch Halpern, kept catching Sammy, who lost 2 points for his fouls. Mostly they were crushing shoulder thrush. When it was all over, Sammy won a close split decision. Neither side had any juice in Vegas, so I believe the scoring was legitimate. It was a hard call. Hector wilted just a little bit in the last 2 rounds, probably from making weight. Both fighters, of course, left everything in the ring. At the press conference, you could watch Sammy's head swelling from all the shots he'd taken. I mean, it was growing bigger while you watched it. Terrifying, looking like a horrible traffic accident. You wanted to turn away but couldn't. After an hour or so, he looked like an extraterrestrial with a watermelon head. Hector, who would later become my friend, had absorbed an equal barrage, but looked like he just played maybe 9 holes of golf. Not a scratch or a welt. It was a supernatural and in its way, even more terrifying to see Sammy's head. What manner of band is this? That's awesome stuff right there.
And you know what? That was actually one of the last fight cards at Caesars too.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense too, timing wise. Look, dude, fucking Holyfield Bow 2. I mean, that shit kind of ruined it, man. Like
I think
after that.
what was the last one? The last one I can recall. I mean, I'm sure. Well, no, actually, the last one I can recall maybe wasn't Margarito Cintron 1 at Caesars.
No.
Am I wrong? It wasn't.
No. I'm talking about like the outdoor, like the
that
the
one. The last one I can
pavilion.
recall. Then maybe you. Oh, that might have been.
It was actually Oscar De La Hoya versus Daryl Tyson
Really?
in '96.
Wow.
Yeah.
So where was
doubleheader with
Taylor,
Julio Cesar Chavez?
so where was David Reed against Felix Trinidad?
Let's find out. That shit was that was at the Caesars Palace, like the main.
Okay, but not the pavilion. Pavilion was De La Hoya, Daryl Tyson.
Yeah.
Wow. Did they knock the pavilion down? Do you know?
To be honest, I don't know. I would imagine, yeah.
That's just it's just one of those iconic venues. You think of like old school, the fights, and think of Holmes getting dropped against Shavers, and every other fighter fighting there, and you see that background, that awning over there and everything. It's kind of like MSG in its own way.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, there's a number of iconic fights that wound up happening there. But that actually, looking back, it wound up basically being Hector Lopez, like his last chance, even though he seemingly got some more after that. And like I said, had a pretty good run after that, strung together some pretty good wins. That was his final chance, especially if you actually watch his loss against Randall Bailey. He wound up going on 2 runs where he was like, all right, maybe he can put something together. But then finally in 1999, he fights Randall Bailey. And I mean, that's the screenshots you were posting earlier with the bandana and shit. Yeah. And I mean, but it's like, you could tell he's got no legs, dude. His legs are gone. We're talking about 1999. This is 15 years after the fucking 1984 Olympics.
And he's lived a hard life at this point.
Yeah, it's not an easy 15 years. It's not a 15 years.
Not like he's like Bernard Hopkins and training his body like Spartan or something.
So and you can just tell, like you might have an iron chin, but not against Randall Bailey all night. You can't.
And Bailey, dude, not only is Bailey one of the hardest punchers of recent time, Dude was scoring knockouts like Julian Jackson-esque at one point. He's still, I mean, you can kind of compare him to it. He's not quite Jackson, but
Even
like,
just that Mike Jones knockout, every
dude,
so often I watch that, and the way that Mike Jones falls, it almost looks like it's edited
yeah,
because it's like his body contorts in such a way that you're just like, why is he falling like that? Like he like twists and then almost like leaps and then falls. It's like, did that just happen? What the fuck? You know, like, but that's how Randall Bailey was
Frankie
doing, folks.
remember the same thing? He just kind of, guys just dropped. And,
It fools, yeah, fools were
yeah.
just going like
So,
going
and
to
that was,
sleep.
that was Bailey in this, at this point, this was Bailey kind of past it when you mentioned some of these fights, right?
Yeah,
This
totally.
is prime Bailey now we're talking, when he still had hair, when he had like kind of a fro going on, he was wearing the Frankie Randall aqua trunks, and um had just, you know, completely annihilated Carlos Gonzalez for the WBO title. So like Bailey was on a rampage. And like you said, at this point, Hector Lopez, you know, it's cool that he got a title shot at the end, but he had no business being in the ring at that point. And at least not against a guy like Bailey. And he kind of knew it too. Like Lopez, to his credit, man. I mean, I remember watching it live because I watched everything back then. And I want to say that the main event might have been Byron Mitchell against Bruno Girard or something like that. That was a weird time and place for Showtime. Let's just put it that way. All right. But
It's searching the world for talent.
yeah, dude, that, you know, a lot of those Don King cards, everyone talks about, you know, gets fond memories and cozy about the Don King pay-per-views, but dude, he was putting on so much shit too on
Yeah,
Showtime.
sometimes you had to root through some bullshit.
A lot of times. But and he but yeah, Lopez was trudged out for this. And like I said, he was a long time contender. I had read about him. This was my first time actually watching him. And knowing, like, from reading from the Ivan Goldman articles that I read, knowing that he, you know, he had a little bit of a sketchy past, and then he comes into the ring and he has the full-on ensemble look. And like he's wearing a boxing robe, but bro, he like totally brings in his he just looks like the dude from the street. But in a cool way. I thought it was the coolest thing I had seen, man. He had the bandana around his head, he had the sunglasses on, the whole look, and he's just kind of chilling there like that, just like, you know, without a care in the world, like he was just going to the grocery store. And I was like, dude, man, you can just tell he was a bad motherfucker right there. Like, just a guy who just wasn't worried about nothing. This was just an average day, whether he was going to win or lose. And I was just like enthralled by it. And
Yeah,
at one point, go ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
And at one point, Bailey, you know, as the fighters tend to, like, when they enter the ring, they go dance around and they pass their opponent. Lopez looked at him and kind of nodded to him. And then he was like, nope. And then he's like, again, with his glasses on, he was like, it's all good. And then he just rolls back. And I was like staring. I'm like, man, holy shit.
You guaranteed either him at one point in his life or somebody that he knows was nicknamed Tweety, Casper,
Yes.
Sad Boy.
Casper, yes.
or Taz or some shit.
Yeah.
You know, nah, bro. It's funny though, because especially being from Southern California myself, like, I'm not trying to say, like, you know, I hung out in places or I'm from places where everybody looked like that, but I'm not unused to seeing fools who look that way or dress that way. Like, that's not unusual for me whatsoever. But even so, to see it in that setting is funny.
It's
You know what I mean?
hilarious.
Almost as if it's
before a fight, yeah.
almost as if it's an entire costume, except for that's probably just the way he fucking rolled every fucking day. You know what I'm saying? Like, everybody's like, oh shit, look at his costume, and he's just like, I'm just fucking chilling.
Imagine they probably asked him, Hector, you want to take off the glasses? Nah, I'm chilling.
They're like, bro, are you really fighting in those fucking house slippers, bro? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And it,
bro,
like,
are you fighting in those black Air Force Ones?
A lot of guys, you can tell, you can tell by body language, he is one of the most relaxed fighters ever. Like, he's been through it all, he's seen it all, nothing bothers him, nothing's really caring. Like, he's past it at this point. Again, Bailey was a rampaging maniac that was tearing everybody up, and Lopez was being used as a sacrificial lamb that had a name to himself. But you gotta love his demeanor up until the very end, because you can just tell he's just really cool, And to his credit, off of experience, because like you said, he had no legs. He was shop worn, just in life and in boxing, like he was done. But just off of his experience, he was able to last a decent amount. Like, what was it, like 7-8 rounds he lasted?
Yeah, he wound up getting stopped in the ninth,
Okay,
but
so yeah,
the
like,
last sequence of like the last couple sequences is like, man, he's just taking a fucking thrashing. And I'm
mm,
talking about like Randall Bailey, like
oh
full
yeah, just
force.
giving him the
But
boot.
like,
Yeah,
even then, what's so crazy is these shots, it's Randall Bailey, like full extension, like bap, bap. And he's taking combinations still before
yeah,
going down. And he's not even like hurt. It's just no legs. He's just like
yeah.
falling down. Like he's like, oh, fuck. Like tough
And no one takes
bastard.
that from Bailey, man. You take a Bailey nuke and you're waking up in a month.
Somehow he was like okay. I mean, his legs were gone, but they were gone going into the ring. Like
Exactly,
that's
exactly.
so obviously an extremely tough bastard to be a couple divisions above where he started, having
Completely
lived a
washed
hard
himself. Yeah.
life and taken them Bailey bombs, bro. That shit does not happen very often whatsoever. So but that also kind of, in my opinion, just adds like to the sadness, because it's almost like what could have been, dude. He only fought once more after that. It's a TKO over a nondescript opponent, and oh my gosh, I don't even know. Is that the Belize flag? I don't even know. Costa Rica. I'm so sorry. I'm part of it is I'm not wearing my glasses and I can't see shit. But the other part is that, yeah, I don't know that flag. I'm not gonna lie.
How dare you, Pat? Just kidding.
I can only know so many flags and so much boxing information in my
I mean,
brain.
look, man, you're not Don King, okay?
Only in America. But that's his last fight in 2000. When you
Yeah.
consider that he had a 15-year career, and like we've started out saying right at the beginning, looking at over his record, it's like there's some surprising gems on there as far as quality. It was much better record than I expected to kind of go through when I was looking over it, but in any case, where we wind up ending up, and we're kind of ending up in a sad place here, and adding to the kind of true crime aspect of it. Well, I guess not so much crime per se, but there's a mixture. um Details are murky. I could not find anything concrete. Maybe Ivan Goldman knows. I mean, I'm to be honest, I don't really
They
know.
just, yeah.
I
Good.
couldn't.
What about his death you're talking about?
Well, and so there's obviously a gap. He dies in 2011, but his last fight's in 2000. That's 11 years. And I was sitting there going like, so where was he? What happened in this 11 years? What's going on? And so I wound up actually finding some interviews with his sons. He had two sons who are now professional fighters, and basically they talked about their dad, and Angel. Well, his son Angel Lopez
Hmm.
was, I think, the more prominent of the two, and a handful of interviews with him talked about his dad, and he had said, without going into detail, that Hector Lopez was convicted of some other crime in the early 2000s and went to prison for 9 years, and that he had visited his dad. He said, starting at a young age, he had visited his dad in prison, and so he was used to seeing his dad in prison, that
Yeah.
was fairly normal for him. But then his dad was in prison for another 9 years, and that shortly after being released from prison in the late 2000s, that he was deported back to Mexico, and that Hector Lopez found his way back to Mexico City, where he was from, and what he was doing, what was going on, absolutely no clue. And then in 2011, in October of 2011, news hit a handful of major US newspapers that he had died from murky details,
Yeah.
an apparent heart attack that was suspected from drug overdose at 44 years old. And that's it. That he was supposedly at the time working with the Mexico national team, the amateur team,
Hmm.
or that he was in some way helping them, uh, according to reports, and according to other reports, was mixed up in drugs, which probably would not have been surprising given his history. Uh, but that's it. And I guess that, again, not to fucking coat this in a bunch of stupid ass sappy bullshit, it is sad. An ending like that where nobody knows what the fuck happened, nobody knows where, nobody knows anything. It's sad because he had a very respectable amateur career, a very respectable pro career. Far too many demons.
Yeah, man, he was so close to being, to being to the edge where he could have pushed himself over. If only could he controlled himself on the outside of the ring and what was going on with him, and his just stints in his battles and all that. He had a lot of demons. I mean, a lot of people have demons. I got demons, we all do, but like his were just like of a different sort that just caused him to really, revert to the dark side and never really give full um full attention to his career, really could have like flourished and just like realized his potential, which definitely could have been as a world champion. I mean, again, he, like you alluded to earlier, he wasn't that long ago, but it was in boxing, that is a lifetime ago in terms of how the sport was. And if Lopez was around today and considering his level of talent and the way he was and all that, there's no reason why he probably wouldn't have been a champion. The guys he was fighting were a lot more disciplined and tougher, in my opinion, than some of the guys he was going against that are considered themselves champions today. You know what I mean? So you can look at it like that. But then again, Lopez just had a lot of vices, and some of the Goldman articles I remember reading in like KO and Ring, he would talk about, well, he would say something to the effect of like, Hector Lopez just got out. I met up with him. We were talking. He said he wanted to show me something. I thought it was gonna be some new prison tats that he got. Instead, it was like scars across his stomach because, again, various gang members wanted to test him, or other, rival members or some other shit or whatever it must be, had an issue with him and tried to shank him out. Like this was stuff he just dealt with all the time. Whether it was stuff on the street and other stuff over there. And like you said earlier, by all accounts, he was a really, really nice guy, but he had no, like he definitely had a past to him, and he definitely did a lot of stuff that people, was really kept under wraps, and no one really knows the full extent of it. And he's kind of mysterious in that way. Not kind of, it's very mysterious, you know. Like that's why I find guys like that fascinating. Guys like Sonny Liston, like other people like that. Like there's such like shrouds of mystery to them, and clearly talented fighters, and by all accounts, not really bad people. They just had, a lot of issues going on with stuff like that. But like Lopez is a more modern version of that, man. Like a guy that's like kind of shrouded in mystery with his past and what he was outside of activities and all this stuff. But everybody that kind of knew him or kind of dealt with him has their own experience with him. Usually it's positive, but they're just kind of tell you too that he's a guy that just couldn't do it.
Came very close. Came
Yeah.
so close, I mean, and who
Just
knows,
like a stroke of luck here or something else here and there, it probably could have worked,
and who knows if he would have just gotten one more opportunity, or if one of those decisions would have gotten his way, would it have been enough to motivate him to keep it together? I don't
Or
know.
even if that fight, like Goldman said in his article, what if the Sammy Fuentes fight was actually shown to much more of the masses as opposed to just a handful of people
That's
locally?
true, yeah.
Because like I said, I saw that. I ended up seeing that fight, and that fight was absolutely awesome. And trust me, if that was shown on television today, people would have gone absolutely apeshit for it in the Twitter era. Oh, they would have went wild, and they would have demanded. And Lopez definitely would have got more fights out of that.
And that's crazy too, because that's like right around the same time as like Lee LaCicero, and
Yeah,
like and that was kind of like considered a closet classic, but even just that got remembered through the years.
because I think it's more accessible. Like for what Lee LaCicero, because I happened on ESPN. ESPN did put it on some of their compilation videos back in the day,
Yeah.
and so many people recorded it that it's like fairly common. You know what I mean? You look up the best ESPN fight, Al Bernstein will mention it right away, and everyone looks for it. No one talks about Sammy Fuentes, and no one talks about Hector Lopez. Guys like these we mentioned before, they get lost to time. Even if it doesn't seem like that long ago, it still is long enough that they become a distant memory. If you're a WBO, if you ask the average boxing fan, name me like 5 WBO champions from the 90s, not named like Tommy Morrison and a couple of others, they're gonna look at you and be like, and understandably so. the WBO title wasn't really taken seriously at that point.
Well,
And
we hadn't yet stepped into the four belt era.
yeah, really.
Dun
I mean,
dun dun.
The UK kind of did to a degree because they took the WBO title and they embraced it sort of, and they were like, but the USA most definitely didn't. And so with such a plethora of like tough contenders and world champions and Hall of Famers during that era, guys like Lopez and Sammy Fuentes and Bolio Gonzalez and others that we've talked about, they just kind of get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, for sure. We've talked about it before, but it was often considered more of like it was a sanctioning organization that was strong in like super middleweight, cruiserweight.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it wasn't like considered like a mainstream organization yet. So I don't even know when the four belt era started, but no, it definitely that probably didn't help Hector Lopez either. That he was, competing in this organization toward the end too. But
Yep.
man, he came close. He came damn close, and it's unfortunate that he had an end the way that he had it.
Totally, man. But that's a sad story that a lot of number fighters have to experience as well. But such is boxing. But the thing is, that's what you and I are here for. You know what I mean? To like remember these guys and tell their stories. Not many people talk about Hector Lopez. We've talked about him a few times here and there, but like it's cool that we get to like talk about him and show his story, and you can hopefully look back on him either with fondness, or if you haven't really heard about him before, look him up even further. And the other fighters that we mentioned today too, kind of same thing.
Totally, dude. Yeah, no question. That's I think that I enjoy what we're doing,
Yeah,
and it's beyond doing any sort of service or anything like that. I enjoy it. I think it's a lot of fun to learn about these fighters myself. It's obviously really unfortunate, like the circumstances that they're almost all tragic. Um, but there's just like we keep talking about pretty much every time we do a true crime episode, the circumstances surrounding a lot of the reasons why these fighters get into boxing, how they stay in boxing, et cetera, et cetera. The sport itself is just welcoming to a lot of this tragedy and a lot of these funky situations. So that's really all we're doing is just talking about stuff that's already happened and stuff that's already kind of come up, and hopefully also remembering these fighters and not just the bad things, but some of the good things about them too.
totally. That's all we can do.
Well, I appreciate you sitting through yet another true crime, discussion for me, bro. It's always a really good time when we do these things.
Yeah, man, this is always a blast, and I can't wait for we do the next one.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of sitting through these, if you sat through this true crime episode of the Knuckles and Gloves podcast, and if you subscribe or listen to on one of the audio podcasts, do please subscribe and also leave a comment, a reply, any of those sorts of things, ratings, helpful. If you watched via YouTube, also, please subscribe, comment, reply, whatever the case may be. And on social media, you can find the Knuckles and Gloves podcast on both Facebook and Instagram. Individually, we're also on probably Twitter more often than not, or at least in terms of conversation. My boy Aris Pina is on there as Punch Zone Aris. I'm on there as Patrick M. Connor. Thank you so much, everybody. Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, all.
Peace, everybody.